Ukraine, March 1940. A Soviet tank designer named Mikhail Koshkin sat behind the controls of an experimental armored vehicle, his hands gripping the steering levers as he guided the prototype through another grueling kilometer of the 2,000-kilometer test drive from Kharkov to Moscow. The temperature hovered near -20 degrees Celsius. Snow fell in thick curtains across the windscreen, but Koshkin refused to stop, refused to rest, refused to let anyone else take his place at the controls. His design team pleaded with him to slow down, to seek shelter, to let someone else finish the journey. He ignored them all. This tank, this specific configuration of steel plates set at peculiar angles, represented something more than another military vehicle. It was proof of a radical idea that contradicted everything the Soviet High Command believed about armored warfare. And if Koshkin didn't prove it worked, if he didn't demonstrate its capabilities under the most punishing conditions imaginable, the project would be cancelled. The design would be scrapped. And the war machine Stalin's engineers were meant to build would face the coming German invasion with obsolete equipment. The tank he was driving didn't look like any tank the world had seen before. Where other armoured vehicles featured vertical armour plates mounted at 90-degree angles, Koshkin's design incorporated sloped surfaces set at dramatic angles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The front glacis plate tilted back at 60 degrees from vertical, the turret sides angled inward, even the hull sides sloped outward from the chassis. To military observers, it looked crooked, improvised, almost amateurish. Traditional German engineering emphasized precision, perpendicular surfaces, clean right angles. This Soviet design looked like someone had taken a conventional tank and bent it. But Koshkin understood something the military establishment refused to accept. He understood that a shell-striking armor at an angle had to travel through more material than the nominal plate thickness suggested. A 45mm plate set at 60 degrees became effectively 90mm thick to an incoming projectile traveling on a horizontal trajectory. The physics was undeniable, the mathematics was irrefutable, but convincing Stalin's paranoid bureaucracy to accept a design that looked wrong required more than calculations. It required this journey, this demonstration, this sacrifice. By the time the prototype tanks reached Moscow for demonstration to Stalin and the Politburo, Koshkin was ill. The exposure, the stress, the relentless driving through winter conditions had taken their toll. But he had succeeded. The tanks performed flawlessly. Stalin approved production, and in December 1939, the Soviet Union officially adopted the design as the T-34 medium tank. Mikhail Koshkin would never see his creation in combat. The pneumonia he contracted during that test drive worsened through the spring and summer. Doctors removed one lung. It wasn't enough. On September 26, 1940, barely 6 months after his triumphant demonstration in Moscow, Koshkin died at age 41. His deputy, Alexander Morozov, took over as chief designer. Full-scale production of the T-34 began at multiple factories across the Soviet Union. The man who would later be celebrated as the father of the 34 passed away in relative obscurity, but his crooked armor plates, his angled surfaces, his deliberate rejection of conventional perpendicular design philosophy would soon teach the German Wehrmacht a lesson they never anticipated. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what German Panzer crews expected to encounter when Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941. Nazi propaganda had spent years constructing a narrative about Soviet industrial capability. The message was simple and psychologically reassuring. Soviet factories produced crude, obsolete equipment. Soviet designers copied Western technology poorly. Soviet manufacturing quality was substandard. German engineering remained superior by definition. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that spearheaded the invasion seemed to confirm this narrative. They had proven devastatingly effective in Poland and France. Their crews were confident, experienced, victorious. They expected to encounter Soviet armor similar to the T-26 and BT tanks they'd seen in intelligence reports. Lightly armored, poorly designed, easily destroyed. The Red Army possessed nearly 1,000 T-34 tanks by the invasion date. They were concentrated in 5 mechanized corps, representing approximately 4% of the Soviet tank arsenal, but their distribution was scattered. Many units had received their T-34 seconds only weeks before the invasion. Crews had minimal training, sometimes fewer than 5 hours of driving experience. Commanders had never seen the tank before the war began. Radio equipment was scarce. Spare parts were non-existent. The logistical chaos created by Stalin's purges, which had eliminated half the armor division's officer corps, compounded every problem. German intelligence had identified the existence of a new Soviet medium tank, but they dismissed it as insignificant. How could Soviet designers, working in factories that barely produced tractors, create anything superior to German precision engineering? The answer arrived on the second day of the invasion, June 23, 1941. Multiple German units along the massive 1,800-mile front reported encounters with an unidentified Soviet tank type. The reports described a vehicle approximately 26 tons in weight, armed with a 76.2mm gun, featuring unusual sloped armor that seemed to deflect anti-tank rounds with disturbing effectiveness. A German anti-tank gun crew recorded their experience in a report that would circulate through Wehrmacht headquarters with increasing urgency. Half a dozen anti-tank guns fired shells at the Soviet tank, creating a sound like a drum roll, but the vehicle drove steadily through German defensive positions like an impregnable prehistoric monster. Lieutenant Stupe's tank scored hits on the T-34 once, at approximately 20 meters range, and 4 additional times at 50 meters, using Panzer Granit 40 armor-piercing ammunition from a 50mm gun. The shells had no noticeable effect. The German gunner's description captured the psychological impact perfectly. Each shot seemed to be a direct hit, but the shells bounced off. The fire didn't seem to bother the tank in the least. This wasn't supposed to happen. German doctrine assumed armor superiority. German training emphasized precision gunnery. German confidence rested on the belief that their equipment represented the pinnacle of military technology. The crooked Soviet tank shattered all 3 assumptions simultaneously. Within weeks, more detailed reports reached German headquarters. The T-34 featured armor that was simultaneously thinner and more effective than anything on German tanks. The front glacis plate measured just 45mm thick. The Panzer IV Ausf D carried 30mm frontal armor. But when military engineers calculated effective thickness accounting for the slope angle, the results were devastating. At 30 degrees of impact, the angle most anti-tank rounds would strike, the Panzer IV's perpendicular armor provided an effective thickness of approximately 31mm. The T-34's sloped armor, even though nominally only 45mm thick, provided an effective thickness of 51mm. If a shell struck the T-34's glacis plate traveling perfectly level with the ground, the effective thickness doubled. 90mm of protection from 45mm of steel. The slope alone transformed mediocre armor thickness into formidable protection. And that was before considering the secondary effect. Shells, striking at oblique angles, didn't just penetrate less effectively. They ricocheted. The sloped surfaces deflected incoming rounds, sending them careening away from the tank instead of punching through. German gunners watched their carefully aimed shots bounce harmlessly off Soviet armor designed to look wrong. The implications extended beyond individual tank engagements. The T-34 also featured wide tracks that distributed weight across a larger surface area, reducing ground pressure and improving mobility across soft terrain. While German tanks with narrower tracks sank into mud and got stuck in snow, T-34 seconds kept moving. The diesel engine, derived from an aircraft power plant design, produced 500 horsepower and offered 30% more power than comparable gasoline engines. More importantly, diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline. German tanks had a disturbing tendency to brew up, bursting into flames when penetrated. T-34 seconds could absorb hits that would have incinerated a Panzer III. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, encountered the T-34 inches combat near Mtsensk in October 1941. His 4th Panzer Division suffered grievous casualties. Guderian, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armor commanders, sent an urgent report back to Germany. He wrote that this was the first occasion on which the vast superiority of the Russian T-34 to German tanks became plainly apparent. The division suffered losses they couldn't afford, and the tactical situation was deteriorating because German anti-tank weapons simply couldn't deal with the new Soviet design effectively. The report created shockwaves through the German military establishment. Guderian didn't just request better equipment, he suggested that Germany should produce a direct copy of the T-34, build it exactly as the Soviets had, abandon German design philosophy entirely, and just replicate what worked. The recommendation revealed how desperate the situation had become. The proposal was rejected immediately. National pride wouldn't permit copying a Soviet design. German engineers insisted they could do better. But the damage to German confidence was irreversible. They had encountered a weapon system they couldn't match with existing equipment, and the Soviets were building them faster than Germany could respond. On November 20, 1941, a special Panzer commission arrived on the Eastern Front to assess the T-34 directly. German engineers examined captured examples meticulously. They studied the sloped armor, measured the angles, calculated the effective thickness. They analyzed the suspension system, dismantled the diesel engine, evaluated the 76.2 mm gun. Their report identified 3 features that Germany needed to incorporate immediately into next-generation tank designs. First, a long overhanging gun with good penetration capability. Second, large tracks providing improved off-road mobility. Third, sloped glacis armor providing greater protection with modest thickness. The assessment marked a fundamental shift in German tank design philosophy. Every major German tank produced before 1941, the Panzer III, Panzer IV, and even the Tiger I heavy tank featured perpendicular or near-perpendicular armor. The Germans had believed that adequate protection came from thickness alone. Make the plate thick enough, and it would stop any shell. The T-34 proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. A thin plate at the right angle outperformed a thick plate at the wrong angle. The crooked Soviet armor that looked amateurish was actually brilliant, but understanding the problem and solving it were different challenges. The weapons department reported that Germany would have difficulty copying the T-34's design directly. Soviet steel alloys used different compositions than German steel. The diesel engines required would compete with naval vessels for limited supplies. Manufacturing the distinctive sloped hull would require retooling factories currently optimized for perpendicular plate assembly. Even if Germany wanted to copy the Soviet design, they lacked the industrial capacity to do it quickly. Instead, 2 new tank programs received urgent priority. The first would become the Panther medium tank. The second would become the Tiger II heavy tank. Both would incorporate sloped armor influenced directly by the T-34. The Panther design showed the clearest T-34 influence. The front glacis plate sloped dramatically back at 55 degrees from vertical. The turret featured angled surfaces. The wide tracks and powerful gun directly responded to Soviet capabilities. When Panthers finally reached production in 1943, German tankers finally possessed equipment that could engage T-34 seconds on favorable terms. But the Panther weighed 45 tons, 50% heavier than a T-34. It required a complex Maybach engine producing 690 horsepower. Manufacturing was slow, expensive, complicated, and by the time Panthers reached the front in significant numbers, the Soviets had already upgraded to the T-3485 with an 85 mm gun. The production numbers told a story of industrial mathematics that no amount of German engineering excellence could overcome. During the entire war, Germany produced approximately 6,557 Panthers. Total Tiger I and Tiger II production combined reached just over 2,000 vehicles. The Soviet Union, by contrast, manufactured more than 57,000 T-34 seconds by the end of 1945. 34,780 T-34 variants with 76 mm guns were built between 1940 and 1944. Another 22,609 T-3485 models rolled off assembly lines between 1944 and 1945. For every German Panther, the Soviets produced nearly 9 T-34 seconds. For every Tiger, they produced more than 28 T-34 seconds. The crooked armor plates that German engineers initially dismissed as crude Soviet improvisation were actually designed for mass production. The sloped surfaces required simpler manufacturing processes than the complex perpendicular assemblies German factories specialized in. A Soviet factory worker with minimal training could weld angled plates together. The diesel engine used readily available components. The suspension system was robust but unsophisticated, designed for battlefield repair rather than technical elegance. German Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, who commanded armoured forces throughout the Eastern Front campaigns, provided the most succinct German assessment of the T-34. When asked years after the war about Soviet equipment, he called it simply the finest tank in the world. This from a commander who had access to Tigers and Panthers, who understood German engineering capabilities intimately, who had every professional and national reason to praise his own nation's designs. But professional military judgment forced him to acknowledge what the crooked Soviet armor had accomplished. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the full implications of the T-34's design philosophy. Germany assembled the largest concentration of armoured forces in military history for Operation Citadel. Nearly 3,000 tanks, including over 200 Tigers and approximately 200 Panthers making their combat debut. The Soviets deployed approximately 5,000 tanks, predominantly T-34 seconds and T-34 85 seconds. German forces possessed qualitative advantages in crew training, tactical doctrine, and individual tank performance, but the Soviets possessed overwhelming quantitative superiority, the result of design choices made by Mikhail Koshkin years earlier. The Panthers suffered catastrophic mechanical failures, transmission problems, suspension breakdowns, cooling system failures brought most of them to a halt before reaching combat. The Tigers performed better, but consumed fuel at rates that German logistics couldn't sustain. The T-34 seconds, by contrast, kept running. When they broke down, crews repaired them with basic tools under fire. When they were destroyed, 3 more arrived as replacements the next day. The mathematics was inexorable. Germany lost the battle not because their individual tanks were inferior, but because they couldn't produce enough of them fast enough. A captured German order from a destroyed armoured unit at Kursk revealed the psychological burden this disparity created. The order, addressed to German troops, attempted to restore confidence that had been eroding since 1941. It read in part, "You are now waging an offensive with tanks far superior to the Russian T-34 seconds. Until now, the T-34 has been the best tank in the world, better even than our own, but now you have our new Tiger tanks. There is no equal to them. With such a weapon, you warriors of the German army cannot fail to crush the enemy." The fact that German command felt compelled to issue such reassurance revealed how completely the T-34 had shattered Wehrmacht confidence. German soldiers needed to be told their equipment was superior because their battlefield experience suggested otherwise. They had spent 2 years watching Soviet tanks survive hits that should have destroyed them, watching German anti-tank rounds ricochet off crooked armor plates, watching numerical superiority compensate for any tactical advantages German forces possessed. But the story of the crooked armor extends beyond battlefield performance. It encompasses a fundamental philosophical difference in military design that separated Soviet and German approaches to armored warfare. Germany designed tanks at the edge of technical possibility. They extracted maximum performance from complex systems through sophisticated engineering and precision manufacturing. Every German tank represented minor technical achievement. The Tiger's 88mm gun was devastating. The Panther's optics were superb. The mechanical precision was impressive. But these advantages came with costs that proved catastrophic. Complex tanks required skilled mechanics to maintain. Specialized parts became impossible to obtain as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains. Manufacturing time increased as designs became more sophisticated. A Tiger I required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce. A T-34 required fewer than 3,000 man-hours. The ratio was nearly 100 to 1. For the time required to build a single Tiger, Soviet factories could produce 30 T-34 seconds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And when that Tiger broke down far from maintenance facilities, it became a stationary pillbox. When a T-34 broke down, the crew often repaired it and drove it back into combat. The Soviet design philosophy prioritized different values entirely. Koshkin and his team designed the T-34, assuming that crews would be undertrained, that maintenance would be performed under combat conditions, that industrial production would need to scale rapidly. The sloped armor wasn't just about deflecting shells, it was about creating effective protection without requiring thick, heavy plates that would slow manufacturing. The diesel engine wasn't just about power, it was about using fuel that Soviet industry could produce in quantity. The simple suspension wasn't just about reliability, it was about creating a system that conscripted factory workers could assemble without specialized training. Every design decision reflected an understanding that modern industrial warfare would be won by the side that could field the most effective equipment in the largest quantities, not the side that fielded the most technically impressive equipment in limited numbers. Koshkin understood something that German designers refused to accept until too late. The war would be decided in factories, not just on battlefields, and the nation that could produce adequate weapons faster would defeat the nation that produced superior weapons slower. German tank crews who captured T-34 seconds during combat often kept them for personal use, abandoning their German vehicles whenever possible. This preference spoke more powerfully than any technical assessment. When given the choice between a technically sophisticated German tank and a crude Soviet tank with crooked armor, experienced combat soldiers consistently chose the T-34. They chose it because it started reliably in -40-degree cold. They chose it because it could ford rivers without specialized equipment. They chose it because when the transmission failed, they could fix it with basic tools. They chose it because fuel was readily available. They chose it because replacement parts could be cannibalized from any other T-34 on the battlefield. The long-term impact of Koshkin's crooked armor extended far beyond World War II itself. When German prisoners of war arrived at camps across America, many were assigned to work in American motor pools. Professional German mechanics and former tank crews found themselves maintaining the endless stream of military vehicles flowing through Allied logistics systems. For soldiers who had spent years working on Tigers and Panthers, watching American mechanics perform repairs was educational in ways they never anticipated. The Americans, many barely trained teenagers, could repair complex systems without requiring master craftsman skills. Every part had a standardized number. Every repair followed a documented procedure. Every problem had a solution that didn't require improvisation or custom fitting. It was pragmatic, effective, and utterly foreign to German military culture. But it worked better than anything they had experienced. Former Wehrmacht mechanics began to understand what Soviet designers had grasped years earlier. Modern warfare required industrial systems, not just individual technical achievements. When German prisoners of war returned home after 1945, they brought knowledge that would transform their defeated nation into an economic powerhouse within decades. The Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, was built partly on lessons learned from examining both American and Soviet mass production techniques. The Volkswagen Beetle, which became Germany's answer to mass-market transportation, incorporated design philosophy directly influenced by what German engineers had learned from the T-34. Standardization replaced customization. Simplicity replaced complexity. Ease of repair became a primary design criterion. Mass production capability became more important than technical sophistication. Former Wehrmacht mechanics became industrial engineers in the new West Germany. They applied American pragmatism to German precision, creating hybrid approaches that combined the best elements of both systems. The lesson Mikhail Koshkin had proven with his crooked armor plates, that effective design beats elegant design when lives depend on it, became foundational to post-war German industrial philosophy. In 1998, surviving members of the Africa Corps held a reunion. By that point, most participants were in their 70s or 80s, veterans of campaigns across North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front. American veterans were invited to attend. The conversations between former enemies revealed what had truly mattered during the war. A German veteran, speaking about vehicles rather than battles, said something that summarized the entire conflict. His voice broke as he explained, "We never had vehicles like yours. Your Jeep could go anywhere, do anything, and when it broke, anyone could fix it. We had better tanks, better tactics perhaps, but you had better logistics. You taught us that wars are won in factories, not just on battlefields." It was a hard lesson, but it was the right lesson. The T-34's influence on tank design proved permanent and universal. After the war, virtually every nation developing armored vehicles incorporated sloped armor into their designs. The French AMX-30, the British Chieftain, the American M48 Patton, the Israeli Merkava, all featured angled surfaces that traced their intellectual lineage back to Koshkin's crooked plates. The perpendicular armor that had characterized tank design through the 1930s disappeared almost entirely. The lesson that shells striking at angles had to penetrate more material became foundational to armor design globally. Modern main battle tanks still employ the principles Koshkin pioneered. Composite armor arrays are mounted at dramatic angles to maximize effective thickness. Reactive armor tiles are positioned to deflect shaped charge jets. Even the most sophisticated tanks designed in the 21st century incorporate sloped surfaces because the physics remains unchanged. A projectile striking armor at an angle must travel through more material than the nominal plate thickness. The mathematics Koshkin understood in 1939 still governs armor protection in 2025. The final accounting of the T-34's impact reveals numbers that speak for themselves. Over 84,000 T-34 seconds were produced when including post-war manufacturing and licensed production in Poland and Czechoslovakia. It became the most produced tank of World War II and the second most produced tank in history, surpassed only by its successor, the T-54, 55 series. The T-34 served in combat across 6 continents and remained in active military service with some nations into the 21st century. Syrian T-34 seconds saw combat as recently as the Syrian Civil War. Tanks built in the 1940s still functioning 8 decades later. But perhaps the most significant measure of the T-34's impact isn't found in production numbers or battlefield performance or longevity. It's found in what the crooked armor taught the world about how wars are actually won. Mikhail Koshkin died believing his design might be rejected, might be replaced by more conventional alternatives, might fail to prove itself before the German invasion arrived. He never knew that his crooked armor plates would help turn the tide of the largest land war in human history. He never knew that German engineers would spend years trying to replicate what he had accomplished. He never knew that his design philosophy would reshape tank development globally. What he did understand, what drove him to complete that punishing test drive through winter conditions that cost him his life, was that the coming war would require more than technical sophistication. It would require designs that could be manufactured rapidly, maintained simply, and deployed in overwhelming numbers. The crooked armor wasn't just about deflecting shells, it was about creating effective protection through intelligent design rather than brute force. It was about recognizing that wars are won by industrial capacity, not just battlefield courage or tactical brilliance or engineering elegance. The German Wehrmacht learned this lesson through painful experience between 1941 and 1945. They learned it watching Soviet factories evacuated from Western Russia continue producing T-34 seconds even as German forces advanced. They learned it engaging Soviet armor that kept coming regardless of German tactical victories. They learned it when their technically superior Panthers and Tigers broke down while Soviet T-34 seconds kept running. They learned it when fuel shortages immobilized their heavy tanks while Soviet logistics kept their forces supplied. They learned it when replacement parts became impossible to obtain while Soviet standardization ensured every T-34 could be repaired with common components. In the end, one designer's decision to angle armor plates at 60 degrees, to prioritize manufacturability over elegance, to design for mass production rather than technical perfection, helped determine the outcome of the largest military conflict in human history. The crooked armor that looked wrong to conventional military observers proved devastatingly right when subjected to the brutal test of industrial warfare. Mikhail Koshkin's legacy wasn't just a successful tank design, it was a lesson about how modern wars are actually won, not through superior technology alone, but through superior production capacity, not through individual technical achievements alone, but through designs that could be manufactured at scale, not through sophisticated systems alone, but through robust systems that soldiers could maintain and repair under combat conditions. The T-34 taught the world that sometimes the most effective solution doesn't look elegant, sometimes it looks crooked, and sometimes that crooked design changes everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.